Greetings adventurers, and welcome to the Loot Goblin Marketplace. I used to think that most bad role-playing experiences came from edgy teens playing their first sessions of D&D and trying to be funny. Then I started to read more horror stories and realized that the worst offenders somehow always stuck with the hobby and continue to ruin all their future campaigns. It is a shame to think of all the new players that got turned off the hobby just because one bad player can jump from campaign to campaign, consuming all fun like a ravenous tyrannid. At least sometimes there are early indicators for these kinds of players so you can kick them fast, like when they want to play an unapologetically evil character that will clearly betray the party.
It's really cute that you're gonna defeat me with the power of friendship and all, but again, I am the devil from the Bible, so...
Today's treasures are a trilogy that covers a player that, no matter how long he's been playing the game, and no matter how much he claims to like the hobby, he will always be that guy. The first story goes by the name Player Wants to Play a Literal Spawn of Satan, is surprised when rejected. But before I go any further, I wanted to give D&D Dice a shout out, my favorite dice shop and where half of my paycheck goes to every month. They've got a lot of options, including their original 11-piece dice sets that they call the King of Crits series. Be sure to use the code LootGoblin to support the channel at dnddice.com, or you can just click the link down in that video description and it'll be added when you check out with your favorite dice. As an edgelord myself, my favorite collections are the Plague Doctor and Blood Hunter 11-piece sets, which I use alongside their Tomb of the Lich dice tower. Anyways, back to the video. Okay, I'll try to keep this shorter than usual. So my friend's DMing a custom setting that we designed together. Basically, it's a dark fantasy world where the players control a squad of artificially created, half-monster hybrids, specifically designed by humans for combating other monsters. So for example, the most commonly utilized hybrids are creatures known as defanged, which are essentially artificially created vampires that exclusively crave the blood of other vampiric entities. Once, if ever, their purpose is fulfilled, they will wither away and die out as well. Pretty much every hybrid has some sort of failsafe in their design that ensures their compliance. Think of DC's comics Suicide Squad and add a grimdark aesthetic to it. My friend is going to be referred to by his full WoW username, Loverboyxxx, which I refuse to abbreviate because forcing people to read the whole thing out is hilarious to me. I'm a fully functioning adult, I swear. And since you wrote that, it's only fair that I do read it out in its entirety. Recently, Loverboyxxx wanted to expand and diversify his player roster, since most of his current players, with the exception of one, are playing defanged characters. That's not necessarily a bad thing since they all play them well, but it is a shame considering the amount of effort put into the world. Personally, I think that he's just feeling guilty that he made me come up with all these races and factions that nobody ended up playing. But you know, that's just a hunch. So he decided to put an ad on Discord stating what he was looking for. For context, it is a larger server that hosts a variety of TTRPG games with their own dedicated channels. His only requirements were for any potential player to familiarize themselves with the basics of the lore and choose a species that isn't a defanged. Straightforward enough, right? At least most of the other candidates thought so. That is with the exception of one, who we will call Suckula. Suckula was one of the last people to respond to the ad, by which point Loverboyxxx had already filled the desired slot in his party. However, Suckula was particularly enthusiastic, emphasizing that they were a big fan of classic horror and that they had been looking for a setting like this for a while. Being the stern and yet merciful god that he is, Loverboyxxx let them know that they could free up an extra slot and asked them to submit their character's backstory for review so he could figure out how to integrate them into the current plot. Also, yes, he once again made it abundantly clear that he was no longer accepting vampire characters. Other than that, all the other playable, emphasis on playable, species and classes were fine. 2 days go by since their last interaction and no word from Suckula. Loverboyxxx figured that they were either busy or really committed to writing out a detailed backstory. The group was taking a break that weekend, so he had no reason to rush them. On the following Monday, just before heading to bed, he was messaged by Suckula, who provided a Google Docs link for a newly created character. Upon opening said link, our unfortunate protagonist was greeted by walls upon walls of solid text. The glow of the screen illuminated his weary and unreasonably handsome face. His eyes stung from the bright red letters inscribed upon a black background, using a subtly edgy font. Every fiber of his being was telling him to stop, to look away before it's too late. And yet, his morbid curiosity got the better of him, and so against his better judgment, he read on. Now, I don't think it would be right for me to copy-paste the entirety of this person's sheet, so I will just recount what I think are the most noteworthy parts. For one, I'm not sure whether they even read any of the lore. We have a basic list of bullet points that is only like 1,000 characters long. That's only half of Discord's character limit per post. Suckula outright stated that they were a full-fledged vampire, not even the world's version of it, just a classical sleep in a coffin and hang from the rafters kind of vampire, red eyes and long cape included. I'm not throwing shade at the stereotypical archetype, just not what we're going for. Second, instead of choosing a class, they went ahead and made up one of their own. Well, okay, they technically chose a rogue as their profession, but they also added that they were capable of enhancing their attacks with vampiric magic. To answer your question, no, we didn't have anything called vampiric magic in our setting. Hell, even the quintessential D&D style blood magic wasn't fully introduced yet. They were able to turn into a bat and a wolf at will, because of course they were. And my personal favorite, they were able to make other characters into their personal thralls. Overpowered? Unreasonable? Yes, but not entirely unsalvageable so far. After all, Loverboyxxx usually tweaks his class system a bit to accommodate players, and while the fact that this player clearly hadn't bothered to read any of the rules was annoying, perhaps a compromise could yet be reached. Perhaps Suckula could have played some sort of deluded, theatrical antagonist, thinking himself an incarnation of Dracula himself, the legend of whom does canonically exist in the world. Well, all such inclinations were dashed as soon as Loverboyxxx got to the backstory. See, Suckula's character wasn't born conventionally speaking. Oh no, that would be too predictable, too tame. Instead, they were actually among the first vampires to exist, formed from the sizzling blood pools of hell itself. You can probably already guess who their fathers proposed to be. You've read the title. When Loverboyxxx told me this, my first thought was that this person had to be taking the piss. But then I read it, and well, while I can't be 100% certain they weren't just trolling, it was written in such a genuine way that I can't help but think that they were being for real. They even disputed their decline, saying that it made sense for a character like theirs to exist. Gotta love it when people lecture you and try to educate you on your own setting. But of course, Loverboyxxx was the one being unreasonable for not letting them play their bootleg Castlevania reject. Besides, they were actually doing us a favor by contributing to the established and, in their opinion, mundane lore. Internal logic be damned. It's all about that power fantasy, baby. Needless to say, they left after throwing their little tantrum. It's not really a horror experience as much as I just found it ridiculous and wanted to share it. Sure, Suckula is being sort of an ass at the end, and their entitlement and expectations were less than reasonable, but they weren't some comedically awful cartoon villain either. TLDR, player submits an edgy Mary Sue character for approval and is surprised when it gets rejected. Doesn't even get to session 0. Hey now, let's not bash Mary Sue for no reason. Usually if it's a guy, it goes by the name Gary Sue or Marty Stew. So if there's one thing I've learned now, taking out an ad on Discord is going to invite the exact kind of player like this. They see the headline, they see vampires, their edginess just kind of bubbles up in them and they're like, finally, I get to play my OC. And then they apply, you know, maybe they read your stupid lore, but they're just going to correct the lore to something way cooler when they actually get in game. This is 100% an example of one of those edgelords who has probably played in hundreds of campaigns, he'll tell you, but he doesn't mention the fact that most of them either didn't make it past the first session, or in this case, you know, he didn't make it past session 0. But he's just waiting to pull out this perfect character that apparently only he understands and no one else thinks is good. But wait a minute, you might recall that I said the person who is the edgelord, the person who's the problem player, is in all 3 campaigns. And clearly Suckula didn't make it past story 1. Well, that's because in the next 2 stories, the focus turns to our Loverboyxxx here. You'll see a little bit more what I mean in the second story. Player becomes infatuated with my NPC, demands I ERP with her. I'll start off by giving you all some context. I've always been interested in the storytelling aspects of RPGs, however, I haven't had the greatest of experiences when trying to get into traditional TTRPGs like D&D and the like. Stories for another time, this is long enough as it is. So around 7 to 8 years ago, while I was still in high school, some friends I met through World of Warcraft suggested that I could game master, if you can even call it that, a sort of choose your own adventure style session for them that was primarily focused on plot and RP. The actual mechanics were very simplistic and pretty much only there to settle the occasional dispute, since the purpose of the whole thing was sort of a collaborative writing adventure where the main focus was to tell a story with me acting as the story's narrator. To this day, I'm not sure whether they came up with the concept on their own or if this style of play has an official name. They literally just called it a narrative RPG. I'm sure the more experienced among you can tell me whether that's a thing or not. I've never been much of an RPer, but I'd like to think, a passable writer, especially considering that English isn't my first language. So in spite of my reluctance, I eventually agreed to create a narrative for these characters. Given the rules-light nature of the game, a lot of restrictions had to be enforced by the lore and just general common sense. But I rarely had anyone going into business for themselves, since doing so would have been counterintuitive to everyone's enjoyment. There were ways to get your character killed if you really wanted to, sure, but I had no incentive to deliberately stifle anyone, nor did the players have any reason to go out of their way to pick fights they couldn't win. Overall, it was a surprisingly fun time and gave me a chance to flex my creative muscles. I started putting putting more and more effort into the world, crafting stories and adventures my players could choose to partake in, with different outcomes depending on their actions or inactions. That is, until a player that I'll just refer to as Jane came along. Jane started as a new and pretty active member of the World of Warcraft guild my friends and I were a part of. She and one of said friends, henceforth referred to as Loverboyxxx, because he will read this and I'm feeling petty, had apparently grown close and were all up in each other's DMs. At some point, he had even told her about the group's weekly online sessions and invited her to join. It was officially introduced to Jane via voice chat, and I gave her a rundown of the setting, the current campaign's progress, and the general guidelines for designing her character. She seemed pretty receptive to it all, and was eager to join in on the party's adventures, even going the extra mile by making her first character my world's equivalent of a healer so that the party, who was a tight-knit band of former cutthroats, had an incentive to bring her along. It created an interesting dynamic where Jane's sheltered character grew accustomed to the world at the same rate she did, bringing some much-needed contrast to the party's composition. If I absolutely had to nitpick, I'd say that she'd like playing the role of the damsel in distress a bit too often for my liking, but no one else seemed to mind, so I refrained from commenting on it at the time. Without going into too much detail, the setting was a blend between traditional fantasy, Egyptian mythology, and Turkish folklore, where the party often had to leave the safety of the capital and venture into the untamed desert in search for long-forgotten tombs, treasures, and the like. Following the party's decision to side with the guards during an uprising, they were invited into the palace, where they were met and congratulated by the royal family themselves for playing a pivotal role in subduing the rebellion. Pleasantries were exchanged and meaningless titles were granted before the party were sent off back to their base in the slums. If that sounds underwhelming, it's because that was the point. I was trying to establish how detached the nobles were from the plight of their subjects. Despite all my efforts to write them as condescending dicks, one of the members of the royal family, who I'll just refer to as the prince for simplicity's sake, seemed to have left an impression on Jane's character. To clarify, the prince was the youngest of the king's sons and the embodiment of narcissism. I wrote him to be as douchey and elitist as possible, which made the healer's sudden crush on him all the more baffling. Yes, I described him as very physically attractive, but that was literally his only redeeming quality, and there was no shortage of traditionally attractive NPCs and player characters surrounding her constantly if she really wanted to go down that route. That said, Jane's character was meant to be naive, so I figured her swooning over a guy that despises everything she represents could have been used to highlight her inexperience. Unfortunately, it was nothing as self-aware as that. You know, I want to agree with you, but this is a DMing 101 thing. If you want the villain to be a villain, don't make them hot, because someone will always simp for them. There are people in so many fandoms that will unironically say if a person is hot, that's the only redeemable characteristic that they need to have, and they will commit war crimes on behalf of the person they're simping for. So you gotta really ugly up your royal family if you want the party to overthrow them. Okay, now back to the story. Both in character and out of character, Jane kept bringing the prince up, much to the rest of the party's annoyance. She insisted that they fully align themselves with the crown in hopes of earning more favor, while simultaneously asking me when they were going to be meeting him again. As you can probably guess, Loverboyxxx was particularly and quite vocally against this for obvious reasons. Perhaps I should have been more stern in railroading them away from that entire plotline, but in my defense, I was really committed to adapting to everyone's choices. Jane got her way eventually, dragging everyone with her and forcing me to come up with more and more stuff they could do for the local gentry. I made a point of clearly telling her that her efforts were appreciated, but it wasn't getting them any closer to another audience with the prince. Keep in mind that this was an NPC I hadn't even put that much thought into at the time, since I never expected him to be anything beyond an entitled prick whose entire purpose was to symbolize the blatant disconnect between the common man and the ruling class. I could have and eventually did flesh him out more, but at the time, nobody apart from Jane cared about him enough to justify doing that. Loverboyxxx was getting pretty fed up by Jane's infatuation with an NPC and out of character demanded that we move on to something else. I explained that I'd been presenting them with different plot hooks this entire time, but instead they kept catering to the healer's whims, who had pretty much assumed somewhat of a de facto leader role. If nothing else, the mental image of a ragtag group of hardened outlaws following around a teenage girl pursuing her crush was sort of amusing. Finally picking up on the group's frustrations, Jane relented and we were allowed to move on to something else. It was at this point when Loverboyxxx's character started trying to get closer to Jane's. While awkward at times, at least made sense since they had a thing IRL. Both of their characters were of a similar age and didn't interfere with my storytelling. Jane was open-minded about the idea but didn't seem particularly excited about it. Her healer and his cutthroat continued with their in-character flirting throughout several campaigns, but the relationship never evolved past the occasional innuendo or remark. All was well until the fateful evening morning when I saw that Jane had messaged me several times on Skype. When I opened our conversation, I saw paragraph upon paragraph of her, I'm assuming in character since most of it was surrounded by quotation marks, proclaiming her love for the prince and straight up demanding to meet him again. It's been a long time, so I don't remember exactly what she said, but I distinctly remember her threatening to leave the friend group altogether if I didn't make it happen. She went on to guilt trip me by saying that it would have been my fault if Loverboyxxx, I kid you not, killed himself over her leaving without a word, since she was apparently helping him battle through some mental issues none of us were aware of. I honestly had no idea how to react. I remember just sitting there reading through her messages and trying to formulate some adequate reply in my head. Eventually I settled on the worst thing I could have probably done. I promised to narrate a private, non-canon exchange between her healer and my NPC. Obviously she agreed and was pretty enthusiastic about it, as though she hadn't just threatened my friend's mental health in order to get her way. I have no excuse for choosing to indulge her instead of immediately talking to Loverboyxxx about the whole thing. I guess I was both worried about him and scared of our friend group disbanding, which eventually happened anyways, but over an unrelated incident. Fast forward to the day of my private session with Jane. The scene opened with the prince standing on a balcony overlooking the royal gardens and her character being invited into his quarters. I obviously knew what she was after, so I made up some bullshit reason as to why he had taken a sudden interest in her. I don't remember what it was exactly. Both expressed his inexplicable infatuation with each other and things obviously got heated. So I hurried to fade to black, only Jane wasn't having it. She was basically expecting me to ERP with her, something I had never done and had no interest in doing. I explained to her at the time I wasn't really interested in exploring sexual stuff both in and out of character. Cue the explicit content. That's right, folks. Jane seemed to have thought that all I needed was some inspiration, and so, in her infinite wisdom, proceeded to spam me pictures and gifs of explicit acts she wanted my character to do to hers. Then she went on to make the whole thing 10 times weirder by expressing how this sort of content was making her feel. Though both of us were 18 at the time, I still don't feel comfortable recounting her exact words verbatim. Let's just say that she was making me increasingly uncomfortable until she left me no choice but to tell her off, which she took as well as you'd expect. She left the group soon after and blocked all of us, including Loverboyxxx, who took it hard, but got over it after confiding in the rest of us instead. Not sure what Jane has been up to since then. I had seen her mentioned in passing a few times before our WoW guild got disbanded for good, since most of us moved on to other games and hobbies. Apparently, she currently is married, so I genuinely wish her all the best and hope that she has grown as a person since the above mentioned incident. Only recently did me and Loverboyxxx reconnect, who you can thank for reminding me about Jane and directing me to this subreddit. It's a mildly uncomfortable experience at best compared to the other stories I've read on here, but I thought it might still be worth sharing. TLDR, back in high school, I was convinced by my friends to narrate a sort of rules-light storytelling RPG for them. Everything was going well until one of my friends brought along his long-distance girlfriend to our sessions. For some reason, she became obsessed with an NPC of mine and pretty much blackmailed me, using my friend's mental health in order to force, among other things, a relationship between our characters. And that concludes the second story. What I think is really funny about how this is structured is it's a situation where you're told Loverboyxxx is the villain of the trilogy, and you're expecting them to come into conflict early, but no, instead there's like a seasonal villain who gets killed off by the end of the season. You know, the finale is always that person being destroyed, and then you're like, all right, next to Loverboyxxx. But then you get to the second season, now Jane comes in, she's completely awful, she gets killed off by the end of it, and Loverboyxxx, it still remains a mystery exactly what he's done. So let's talk purely about Jane here. I don't know why the author downplays how bad Jane is. I mean, this is a person who keeps sending you explicit content and demands you to ERP with them. Otherwise, they're going to break up with their boyfriend, and then they kind of drop the bomb. Oh yeah, by the way, you know, they're on edge. They might end their life if I do this. So it's really on you if you don't ERP with me. I really want to know how hot you describe this prince. It sounds like you really just made him seem pretty run-of-the-mill, but he was just conventionally attractive and of royal blood, and this person's swooning over it to the point where they're literally blackmailing you for just one non-canon ERP session. I know you guys mentioned Skype in the second story, so it's a little bit older, you know, you don't have Discords to ERP with people, but I'm sure there's forums, there's plenty of places where they can get their horny out and not have to put you through it. So yeah, I'm really sorry that happened, and Loverboyxxx really has to stop bringing shitty people to the table. At least with Suckula, Loverboyxxx brings a guy, says, hey, I put out an ad, I mentioned our lore, he seemed a little too excited about vampires, but let's just hear him out. Let's see what he writes up. And when the guy hits you with this 10-page fan fiction, yeah, he gets mad, but he doesn't start, you know, blackmailing you like Jane game did. So I don't know, this story is completely wild and you definitely downplayed it, so I'm worried that story 3 is going to be even worse. And reading the title, which goes by Vampires and Catgirls and Nipple Rings, oh my, maybe it is worse, so let's just jump right into it. As I mentioned in a previous story, Loverboyxxx and I recently reconnected. Unlike myself, he never stopped being interested in RPGs ever since our group fell apart years ago, and is now an avid D&D player and occasional DM. Pertaining to the latter, some time ago he asked me to help him build a world of his own, since the people he regularly played with had expressed interest in a more narrative-driven campaign. This will be another lengthy one, as I regale you with the thrilling tale of Ben, the brooding brandisher of beefy breasts, and his accomplice, Cody, the Catgirl connoisseur. Potentially not safe for work content ahead, you have been warned. Man, we could have used that warning in the second one, dude. It all began one gloomy Sunday evening. My dear friend Loverboyxxx invited me to a Discord call with his wayward band of eager adventurers. Since let's face it, I will be the one doing most of the world building. I wanted to gather everyone's input as to what kind of story they were looking to experience. I had already had a few settings in mind, but I figured that it might be a good idea to gauge the group's interest beforehand. I like to think that I have a knack for world building, hence why Loverboyxxx wanted to include me, but it tends to take me longer than most to actually write all ideas down, partially due to English being my second language, and also other factors outside of my control that I don't feel like specifying. The point being that I didn't want to spend time developing a world nobody wants. 4 of the 5 players were actually incredibly nice to me, and I quickly understood why Loverboyxxx liked playing with these people. That is, with the exception of one, the aforementioned Ben, not his real name. You see, while the rest of the group wanted a medieval high fantasy setting, Ben insisted on it being set in a modern world under the pretense that he was tired of, I quote, swords and dragons and shit. Now don't get me wrong, personally I sort of get where he's coming from, but he came across as a stubborn, petulant child that talked over anyone who suggested a compromise. Cody, also a made-up name, who was his brother, was initially on the majority side, but was quickly pressured by Ben into changing his tune. For context, everyone involved in this is in their early to late 20s. Was it not for Loverboyxxx chiming in and telling them to both essentially shut the hell up and let everyone talk, I would have left the call then and there. We eventually found a middle ground and settled on a story set in a fictional version of Victorian-era London, with elements of dark fantasy, eldritch horror, a la Bloodborne. The group played a special unit of half-monster hybrids who were artificially created for the sole purpose of hunting down other monsters. For example, the Defanged were humans voluntarily inflicted with a heavily refined version of vampirism that grants them most of the benefits of being a full-blooded vampire, but it makes it so that they only crave the blood of other afflicted creatures, ensuring that once their purpose is fulfilled, they'd essentially starve to death. I took everyone's suggestions and conceptualized several other races and factions that all follow a similar philosophy, then spent the following week compiling the world's lore while also keeping it loose enough so that Loverboyxxx could easily fill in the blanks with his own ideas, and then presented it to the group the following weekend. Almost everyone, including Ben, seemed pretty happy with the result. All that was left now was for Loverboyxxx to integrate the actual game mechanics into the setting. Cody, however, wasn't completely sold on the idea yet. He was usually far meeker compared to his older brother and only spoke his opinion if it echoed Ben's. Not this time. For you see, dear reader, in my conviction to create a consistently gritty and oppressive atmosphere, I had neglected to account for something, a cornerstone of every successful RPG. But what about Catgirls? So yeah, to reiterate, Cody really, and I mean really, wanted to play as a Catgirl. Not sure why he didn't say anything during the initial call, but regardless, now he was dead set on it. He hinted that he wouldn't participate if he couldn't be one. My friend was about to shoot the idea down and let Cody walk, and in hindsight, I probably should have let him, but being the diplomatic doormat that I am, I said that we could probably conceive something close to his ideal character that also fitted the setting. After all, we already had werewolves whose entire shtick was morphing only certain parts of their anatomy to get the edge in battle without going completely feral. It wasn't that far of a stretch, right? Behold, the mother of all assholes, the Nikomata, a supernatural species loosely inspired by our world's yokai equivalent, entities and spirits in Japanese folklore. Unlike lycanthropes, the Nikomata started off as just normal cats that were changed into half-human hybrids through some sort of Eastern occult magic. In addition to the aesthetic traits such as the obligatory cat ears and tail, they possess the weapons, senses, and agility of cats with little to no drawbacks. However, if they even stray slightly from the edicts of their highly spiritual sect, they'd be reverted back to regular animals. The concept wasn't great, but it was good enough. So far, you can probably tell that we were going for a sort of Suicide Squad kind of vibe. Ideally, it would have been up to the player players to decide whether they wanted to blindly follow orders or to work together in order to find some sort of loophole in their design and turn on their handlers. All of this was, of course, discussed with the group, and they absolutely loved the idea. Even Cody was inspired now that he could be his true weeby self. I've got no room to judge considering that I was the one who made it possible. From here on out, my involvement in the campaign's progress was negligible. So much of what I'm about to tell you is from my friend's perspective as the DM. I have no reason to doubt him, but I figured that I should mention that for the sake of transparency. The party was gathered at an abandoned inn outside of town, where they were briefed by their handler regarding their upcoming mission. They were to hunt down a group of cultists sulking around in the sewers and stop them from summoning some sort of Lovecraftian creature with mind-altering abilities. They were given one in-game day to choose their equipment and prepare, aka establish their class and roleplay amongst themselves. Loverboyxxx apparently wanted all the introductions out of the way first before the plot properly kicked in. Ben was playing a defanged male duelist named Maximilian with a tragic backstory whom he described as tall, muscular, fair, handsome, and crucially, wearing a leather harness that emphasizes broad, bare chest. Already an odd thing to put so much emphasis on, but rest assured it gets weirder. You know how some authors go excessive lengths to describe a female character's chest, to the point where her breasts are pretty much an extension of her personality and the focal point of every scene she's in? Yeah, that only applied to a male character. While the rest of the group became acquainted, Maximilian stuck to the shadows, communicating only through grumbles and the occasional pectoral flex. My favorite quote has to be, "The chest of Maximilian shines in a tempting way while he's waiting to be approached." When nobody took the bait, Ben made an out-of-character remark towards his brother, very heavily implying that Cody, who was actually doing an alright job fitting in with the rest of the crew, should have been paying more attention to him. Cody complied, which Ben interpreted as an invitation to pretty much assume control of his precious Catgirl, describing how her eyes went wide when she noticed the sheen of Maximilian's smooth pecs. No, I'm not making this shit up. Yeah, honestly, that sounds too specific to make up. For the sake of everyone who has to witness two brothers pretending to awkwardly flirt with each other, all of that while one of them was trying to do a squeaky schoolgirl voice, Loverboyxxx decided that was quite enough bonding for the time being and moved the campaign along, skipping to the newly formed squad of misfits descending down into the sewer. Overall, the actual gameplay portion proceeded as it usually had. Everyone played their role competently, and after fighting their way past droves of minor abominations, reached the hidden chamber where the ritual was being conducted. They easily slaughtered the cultists before they could fully summon their patron deity, who was teased as the eventual endgame boss for Chapter 1, but was intended as a year-long campaign. Following the battle, Ben started to act as though his character was badly injured, despite him having sustained little to no damage during most of the encounters. He insisted that the group's physician, obviously another female character, look him over. Upon her begrudgingly inquiring about his injury, it was, of course, described in great detail as a large gash across Maximilian's strong, brawny, muscular, firm yet soft, rugged yet sensual, morally complex, character arc defining, and suspiciously perky man-teats. I'm exaggerating, but you get the point. After a collective virtual eye roll by almost everyone involved, Maximilian was unceremoniously patched up and the group returned to their hideout for some downtime. It was Cody's turn in the limelight, with his older sibling still selling his character's injury, props for consistency at least, and returning to his room. Cody was finally given the opportunity to shine. Remember how I mentioned that he had attempted to do a stereotypical squeaky anime girl voice before? Well, my man decided to double down and now exclusively spoke like that during every single interaction. "Hey Catgirl, you want a drink?" Oh god, I don't want to do the voice. "Yeah, only if it's milk, and don't forget to put in a bowl, ooh." Come on, that hurt. Yes, it was as cringeworthy as it reads, and yes, it clashed with the overall bleak aesthetic of the setting. But having a fully grown man with a heavy Scottish accent trying to unironically sound cutesy was at least funny in an endearing sort of way, unlike Ben, who was just plain obnoxious. Wait, you made me do the voice and then you mentioned that he's Scottish? Alright, we're doing this again. "Yeah, only if it's milk. And don't forget to put it in a bowl, ooh." Yeah, that's better. Speaking of whom, he could still occasionally interject and remind everyone that Maximilian was now slowly changing into casual clothes, but oops, he forgot to lock his bedroom door. How awkward would it be if someone was to check up on him at this exact moment, right guys? Haha. No one ever did, by the way. Good, keep it that way. As the campaign went on, Ben continued to find new ways of objectifying his beefcake. One of my favorite highlights is the time when Maximilian was briefly reunited with his estranged sister. Before going their separate ways, she had given him their dead mother's earrings as a parting sentimental gift. try and guess what he did with them. If you guess that they used them as nipple piercings, then congratulations, you've been paying attention. In a weird way, I sort of admire his commitment to the trope. All that said, I wouldn't be writing this if it wasn't for what happened during the campaign's climax, pun intended. Let's set the scene. In spite of the party's best efforts, the previously mentioned eldritch entity was finally summoned and unleashed upon the populace. Madness and bloodshed filled the streets. Our band of unlikely heroes had barricaded themselves at the abandoned inn, savoring their last moments of peace before having to confront the horrors that awaited beyond those walls. Everyone was gathered at the bar for one final shot of liquid courage. Suddenly, almost as if prompted to do so, our resident Catgirl excused herself and scurried off to the back. She was gone for quite a while, and the rest were already at the door, preparing for a grueling gauntlet of increasingly challenging encounters. When asked what his character was doing, Cody refused to outright state. Again, almost as if someone was telling him not to. Then Maximilian undertook the initiative to go check on her, which was uncharacteristic in and of itself. It turned out that she had run off to pleasure herself one last time, and was now caught in the middle of the act by our moody duelist conveniently walking in on her. Upon being discovered, which was painfully staged, Cody went on to describe in detail the exact pose he had found her in, along with the object she'd been using as an improvised toy. The stock of a flintlock, if you're curious, and no, I don't know why. Needless to say, everyone present was speechless. I mean, how do you prepare for something like that? The pair interpreted the stunned silence as encouragement, but just as Ben was presumably about to join in on the fun, Loverboyxxx promptly interrupted their scene. He announced that they'd be taking a break for an hour or two, during which he dragged both brothers into a private call and told them to keep stuff like that out of his game. Yes, the setting had some mature themes, but forcing everyone to listen as they graphically indulged each other's fetishes crosses more than a few lines. I'm not sure how I would have handled it personally. Maybe the more experienced DMs among you can share any similar experiences and how you've dealt with that. I think I speak for everyone listening right now. I have no remote idea on how the hell I would handle that. I mean, seriously, what is going on? You know, when I read this, I think the author kind of misspoke when they were saying that Loverboyxxx was the problem person. Yeah, no, everything that they bring in is a problem, but man, this guy's unlucky. What the hell? Like, where does he find these people? Did he go to the Moonguard server in World of Warcraft, go to Goldshire and say, hey, do you all want to be part of my D&D campaign? Because that's what it's starting to sound like. And if that's the case, yeah, screw Loverboyxxx. Because putting the author through so many of these situations, at a certain point, it's so incompetent that it's almost intentional. I want to know how long that scene was being described, though, before he shut it down. And to say, oh, we'll be back in an hour or two. No, we end the campaign right there. There's no coming back from this. Let's see how it's handled, though. Thankfully, the story was allowed to conclude almost as intended. The big bad monster was defeated and its surviving mind slaves liberated, even if the group had failed to liberate themselves in the end. Ben quit the server soon after. Cody stuck around for a while longer, but eventually quit as well. Loverboyxxx quickly found replacements, and they've been playing ever since. Some say that if you join voice chat at exactly 3 AM with your volume turned up, you can still hear the faint jingling of the nipple rings. TLDR, 2 real-life brothers participate in a roleplay-heavy campaign. One plays a brooding vampire obsessed with his man-tits, and the other a stereotypical catgirl he insists on authentically voicing. They get increasingly weird with each other until they get told off and afterwards quit the server. Man, I just realized how full circle this story was. So Ben and Cody, they leave, right? And then they have to put out an ad in Discord, and that's where Suckula comes in. And by comparison, compared to Jane, Ben, and Cody, bring back my man Suckula, come on. He just wants to be the main character. He probably was going to talk about how his, like, fangs are folded in, like, glorious Japanese steel 1,000 times and can slice through anything. And he's the OG vampire. He's actually Dracula's dad. Who cares at this point? That's so much better. I mean, come on, bring back Suckula. I genuinely want to ask, how does something like this happen? How does Loverboyxxx consistently find the worst people? It sounds like Discord is a better place to find people because at least Suckula was tolerable. Everyone else seems to be from their World of Warcraft guild. Loverboyxxx truly is the villain of this trilogy just because he keeps creating monsters for some reason. He's the mad scientist cooking up the most cursed people you've ever seen in RPG horror stories. At a certain point, I don't know what this guy's guy's doing. Maybe he's too much of a pushover. But my advice is Loverboyxxx, whatever your personality is, just be the exact opposite of it, because odds are you're going to have a better time running D&D than what you're doing right now. There's really not much more I can say on the subject besides, wow, I am so grateful that all the people I had in college and the people I have currently are not weird like this, because I really don't know what's going on anymore. This last story honestly broke me a little bit. I think I'm going to lie in bed and just kind of stare at the ceiling for the next hour or so. And sorry to Zill, my editor, who I'm going to have to put through listening to this story probably multiple times as he edits it down. Please share your thoughts in the comments. I feel like I was all over the place with this reading because I totally expected it to take a direction where Loverboyxxx was going to do something bad. But this is a great example of how an RPG horror story can happen because the DM does nothing and because the party waits for them to do something instead of stepping in themselves. So make sure to like and subscribe, share the video at your own peril. I hope to see you in the next one. I totally understand if you don't want to come back after this trilogy. Farewell for now.